Hello and welcome to the Grazing Management webinar with a focus on how we can use grazing to improve the persistence, productivity and biodiversity of your pastures. I wish to firstly acknowledge the traditional custodians of our land, the First Nations people, and pay my respects to those past, present and emerging, and wish to welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are joining or watching this webinar. For me, I'm on Dja Dja Wurrung country, and I thank the custodians for their ongoing work and commitment to this land. I also wish to acknowledge the funders of the program, the Healthy Landscapes, Practical Regenerative Agricultural Communities, which is the Macedon Ranges Shire Council, Hepburn Shire Council, the City of Greater Bendigo, Melbourne Water, and the Healthy Colburn Catchment, which is funded by the Colburn Water and North Central CMA and the Upper Campaspe Land Care Network. So thank them for funding this project. So just a little bit about me I grew up on this dairy farm here in Gippsland, on an irrigation dairy farm, and as you can see, milked predominantly Holstein dairy cows, about 450 to 500, and I started to get a real passion after coming home from university about grazing management, and my passion was about harvesting sunlight. And that's what I really started to understand, that's what I was doing when I was grazing my dairy cows. But that farm, we used a lot of chemicals, we used a lot of fertilizer, and we imported a lot of grain and hay. And but today, you know, what I'm going to talk about is sharing the fundamentals of grazing management, which creates diversity, productivity, and persistence. And, you know, if you want to stop watching now, because here's the answer, you know, the answer is really simple. You graze grassland plants properly when the plant has recovered. That's the answer. So you can stop watching now if you like, but what's meant by the word properly and recovered is where the nuance is. And we know that if there is a diversity of plants, if it's grazed properly and recovered, this is good for the plant's persistence and productivity. And it's good for the grazing animals' health and productivity. And if we've got enough time, I'll get a little bit more detail into the grazing animals' health and productivity, but we might not get there tonight. The first thing I wanted to talk about was there's this symbiotic relationship between herds of grazing animals and grasslands. So we know that the animals, you know, graze these grasslands, and importantly, that's really important for these grasslands' health, the defoliation of the grass. So grasses are not like trees that lose leaves and drop down. They just gather around the base, and there needs something to remove it. And that something can be animals, or what the traditional owners did when there wasn't grazing herbivores is that they burnt. So they removed that dead grass material. But we know that there's this relationship with the animals, and in particular their waste, that improves grassland and importantly improves soil life, because there's this massive amount of biodiversity underneath the soil. And I just want to talk about a little bit of a thing that Alan Savory talks about when we're grazing animals. There's complicated, and complicated is putting, for anyone that tries to put IKEA furniture together, that's complicated for some people. But if we've got instructions, we can follow those instructions and we'll get the item built. We can build a car if we've got the instructions. We might make some mistakes along the way, but we can build it. Complex is this idea that there are multiple outcomes possible, and the natural environment is complex. And the other thing I wanted to start this webinar off is everyone's context is different. So the way you might want to manage your property for certain things may be different to your neighbor. And that's okay, because you're trying to meet certain things in your experience in life. And what Charles Massey talks about is that community. So he talks about in the call of his PhD and the call of the reed warbler, if I try to paraphrase, he talks about the energy cycle. So the sun, shining onto green plants, and that assists in the water cycle within the soil and the nutrient cycle within the soil, and that nutrient transferring its way into animals. And the community above ground, the animals above ground, which includes us, and how we manage it. So grazing grasslands, so grazing ecosystem and grasslands in particular are made up of grasses and forbs and legumes. Now, they're also made up of annual plants and perennial plants. So our perennial plants persist longer than a year. And there's also winter active and summer active plants and grasses in particular. And we know, although the research is limited, because we've been spending lots of time on monocultures, so 100% ryegrass pastures or 100% corn or maize crops, but we know from the limited amount of research that's available that when there is greater diversity of perennial grassland plants means greater persistence and productivity for both the plant and the animal, which is the key point. The animal requires a diversity of food that it wants to eat. Just like us, they don't want to eat the same thing meal after meal after meal. So adding diversity is really important. And we also know that by having this grassland that's diverse with species means that the soil is covered and protected, and that the soil moisture is being used all of the time. So if we only have winter active plants, if we get a storm event in the summer, nothing uses that water. It often will run off if we don't have soil cover, and not being, used to grow plant. What's important though is that also that plant is providing the soil biology with things to eat, and so our soils are not dirt. Our soils are alive with a range of different fungi, bacteria, protozoa, a whole range of things. So I just wanted to show this diagram, which is showing that diversity of different plants and the diversity of their root structures. And that root structure is really important to how the soil functions, and therefore how that the biome in that soil actually functions as well. So making sure that we have that diversity of species above ground for our animals to eat, but also diversity of roots and when the energy is being transferred. And importantly, the sugar being transferred into this, or for want of a better word, rather than sugar, sometimes it's called exudates, other times it's just called carbon, because in the soil, they can't get access to carbon. That's that symbiotic relationship that the grasses and plants hold with soil and what's in the soil. So, and it's really important what I talked about, hopefully you're wanting to join this webinar, was to try to understand what the fundamentals of grazing is, to understand what you have and understand where you're going with your grazing land and what impact your management, and it may not be using grazing animals, but what is your management having an impact on these plants that are part of that grassland. So to understand your grassland, again, you have grasses, you have forbs, and I mentioned this before. Forbs are what generally a broadleaf herbaceous plant in a grassland that's not a grass, and I'll touch on what a grass is in a little while. And so examples of forbs are plants such as plantain, capeweed. If you're anything like my place, it's got capeweed on it, and chicory. But legumes are also technically put in a forb. So your clover is a forb. They're just an important subset of that group that we call forbs. And our pasture grassland plants are perennial or annual, and we can usually see if our grass plants in particular are annuals. You can usually go and pull them out, and their roots and all will come out when you pull them out. Is my way of saying, is this an annual plant or a perennial plant? I'm not really sure. Just give it a pull out and it will come, usually roots and all. Because there are so many grasses that look so similar. So in particular, you might have an annual ryegrass that looks, for all intents and purposes, exactly like a perennial ryegrass, but the annual ryegrass will come out, its roots will come out. The other thing to understand is that there are temperate climate, or what we call C3 grasses, or warm climate, sometimes referred to as C4 plants. And the temperate grasses grow best in soil temperatures between 10 and 18 degrees. Now, how do you know what the soil temperature is on your particular property at the moment? You can go out with a thermometer and jam it in the ground and work it out. But for me, again, a simple trick is today's top temperature, I don't know what it was here today, 14 degrees. And it was 2 degrees overnight. 14 plus 2 is 16, divided by 2 gives me 8. So soil temperature is roughly about 8 degrees. And that's my guesstimate for most of us at the moment. Our temperatures, maximum temperatures around that 14, 15, 16 degrees at the moment. We get a bit of a frost here and there. So our soil temperature is about 8 degrees. So it's not ideal for a lot of our temperate grasses to be really growing at their best, but they do grow still at that temperature. Whereas our warmer C4 grasses appreciate soil temperatures a lot higher. So they like that warmer temperature of 18 to 30 degrees soil temperature. Now, the interesting thing, when you, for me at the moment, is going along to footy ovals with my kids and seeing different ovals with C3 grasses and C4 grasses. And what we saw this year is that we stayed warmer longer. So a lot of those ovals, the C4 grasses, stayed active for a long time. Usually they start to shut down in late March, April. This year they headed into May, and then it got cold quite quickly. So we'll see not a lot of the C3 grasses were able to penetrate through those C4 grasses because they were still actively growing. And so we've got examples of what C3 grasses, or cool season, temperate grasses, all words that basically interchangeable in this. So winter and oats, all those cereals are a cool season grass. Winter grass and capeweed is a C3. Your perennials, perennial ryegrass, prairie, cocksfoot, Australian native weeping grass, wallaby grasses, or all those perennial C3 grasses. Warm season grasses, again, you'll see that we use those mainly as crops, millet and maize, and our perennial warm season grasses are paspalum, couch, lucerne. And 250 odd years ago, the predominant species over much of central Victoria in the shires that we work in would have been kangaroo grass, which is a C4 grass that would have been here. And the other thing to understand about your grasses is that they take on different growth forms. So you've got what's called a tufted or clumping form of grass, and that's your ryegrass, your traditional grasses that you see. And then you've got stoloniferous growers. So they've got these runners. Now this diagram's not quite, it's got a rhizome there, which is underneath, and I'll talk about that. But the stoloniferous has got the runners along the top of the ground. Now, classic stoloniferous grower, it is clover plants. It's not a grass, but it runs along. Another classic that most people see is kikuyu. And most gardeners hate kikuyu because of these rhizomes that grow underneath the soil and pop up back in your garden bed. And then you've got these tap-rooted plants. So, chicory, lucerne, plantain have their tap root. And these are, again, just different forms of grasses that we see in a diverse group. Why is it important to understand that? Is understanding where their energy reserves are of these plants. So where is their battery? Where is their battery? So grasses, the plants that photosynthesize, what are they doing right now? So we know when photosynthesis is happening, they are taking in carbon dioxide, and the photosynthetic reaction means that they expel oxygen. But at night time, there is no light. So they actually respire just like us. It's the same reaction. So they need energy reserves to do that, to respire overnight. But most importantly, they need that energy reserves to grow that leaf, that solar panel, to get more energy in. And when the plant is grazed, it needs to get that energy from somewhere, and it comes from that battery. And in our tufted varieties, our battery's in that 4 to 5 centimeters at the base of the plant. In our stoloniferous plants, it's in that runner, so it's close to the ground. And of course, naturally enough, with our tap-rooted plants, that energy is in that taproot. And that's why we eat carrots, you know, because of that taproot. The energy is stored there. So just quickly on the structure of the grass plant. So why am I going through this? You know, what's that got to do with grazing animals? Well, we've got to understand how their plants grow so that we know whether we're actually having a positive impact with our management. So here's a diagram of a stoloniferous grass plant, but it's similar in we just added this one in so that it's got all the features. So grass plant has this growing point down here in the crown or in the base of the plant. So when this plant germinated from a seed, it started with this crown and growing point, and then up comes the through the stem of the plant into a leaf. So out comes the first leaf here, if you can see my pointer. And then from this growing point, up comes the second leaf. And as it's highlighted there, the blade. And then up through the middle comes the third leaf. So that's where they grow from. They grow from this crown or growth point down here. And then when conditions are really well and their energy is being, the plant's fully recovered, it will then possibly send out, if conditions are right and fully recovered, a daughter tiller. So in a tufted or a clumping grass, this daughter tiller will just come off the side here and it'll grow. And it'll use mum for a little while before it then sets its own root system down. When it's a stoloniferous grower, it sends out these rhizomes or stolons, and then it'll set up these daughter tillers. But once this plant looks after itself, this growing point sends out, but it needs to be recovered. The battery needs to be well charged before it does this tillering. The important part to understand is that these growing point or the crown within the crown, for certain plants, ryegrass being one that's been really well studied over the years, if it goes through the winter, this growing point goes through the winter, it's what's called volatilization occurs. And so it says, I've gone through the winter, I will become a seed head in the springtime. So once that growing point, once it says, I am going to go reproductive, that growing point becomes the seed head. And so that plant, the ryegrass plant, that plant is no longer going to produce anything because the growing point has become the seed head. So even though a perennial, so we see that annual grasses, oats, wheat, etc., don't do this tillering as much. We've bred the tillering component out of them and they're an annual plant. And so once this growing point becomes a seed head, that finishes that plant. Whereas perennial plants will do a lot more of this daughter tillering. And that's really important to understand that tillering effect needs to happen. So just going on, and this is a slide that Evergraze I've taken from an Evergraze booklet. It's work by Danny Donaghy in the late 90s, early 2000s. It's predominantly done on ryegrass, but can work, it's a theme that goes through with grassland plants. So we have this first leaf that comes up, and we know that comes from the root that battery. So it uses this battery to get these solar panels out. And once it gets to a certain level of that leaf, you know, in this case, in the ryegrass plant, that second leaf starts to come out. Does it then start to resume growing roots? So later work by Christine Jones talks about these roots being shed. Exudates are being dumped into the ground, carbon being dumped, sugar being dumped into the ground at this stage, so that all the biology that's in the soil says, oh, you're a grass plant, you've just been grazed, here, have some nutrients, have some minerals. And that's what sort of stimulates that symbiotic relationship. And it's not until this plant is starting to grow again and be able to survive. So this panel has come out, it's able to produce its own solar energy by photosynthesis. And that second leaf is starting to come out, that the battery is starting to be restored. And in a ryegrass plant, we see the battery starting to be restored and the growth starts to happen. But that remnant leaf, the leaf that was, and why do we call it a remnant leaf? Because we'll see that it's been eaten. It's got a blunt end, not a pointy end. And that's the remnant leaf starts to die. We know that this plant is very close to being fully recovered. And so its batteries are fully restored in the bottom 4 to 5 centimeters of this plant. The roots are starting to grow. And what happens is not only does this sinusoidal curve happen like this for energy, it also happens, this growth actually happens for the plant and the amount of leaf that's grown. So because leaf 1 and leaf 2 are helping leaf 3 to grow, leaf 3 grows bigger if temperature and moisture are consistent. So this leaf has got these 2 leaves growing, helping it, and the battery is restored. So we get this big amount of growth. And if you pick up your grass plants, you'll see if temperature and moisture have been relatively consistent over a period of time, this leaf will be significantly bigger than these other 2 leaves. And then there comes a point where we're static and it doesn't build up any more energy or any more leaf. There's more dying than growing, or just as much. What's interesting about this for me is this curve also is similar to nutrients or minerals like calcium and magnesium, which are really important for the animal's diet. But the actual opposite happens for certain minerals like potassium and nitrogen. It starts very high above what the animal needs and then drops down when this plant has recovered, because all that nitrogen and potassium are being used to make protein, and becomes a very much a safe level for your animal. So it's really, really valuable to understand that when we have these plants are not fully recovered, the actual balance of that diet for the actual animal is not great as well. So if it's better for the animal if we let it get to this recovered stage, because it's a better diet for them. So you'll often see or hear about different animal problems with nitrate poisoning or milk fevers in animals, and it's often because they're eating unrecovered, not fully recovered plants. Not all the time, but some of the time. So here's just another picture of how the plant tillers. So here's a real live ryegrass plant, and so you can see mum's here and the daughter tillers are growing off down here. Now that if you peeled back that leaf and stem, you'll see where that daughter tiller is right here at that interface. What can happen is, and what's really important to know when you're grazing, is that this growth point wants to have access to light. So it doesn't need very much light, but it needs light to remain down here at that soil interface. And if it becomes shadowed, so it becomes quite a dense clump, and there's quite a lot of material around it, what happens is that growing point will move up the mother plant, seeking light. So and so then if it tillers, if everything's going well for it, it might tiller up here, and therefore these daughter tillers will not have access to the soil, so they will not grow. So a classic example of that is if you go along and you see phalaris that grows in those massive clumps where it's not managed, and you pull open those big clumps where it's 30 centimeters or more diameter, and you look in the middle, there'll be no plants in the middle there because it's got so dense that the growing point has grown up and up and up here, and the daughter tillers have not been able to grow down to the soil, and it starts to thin out. So that's where you'll see phalaris plants, or when you see paddocks of hay that's been taken and it's got quite dense, you'll see these circles where these tufted grasses have grown, but they've been left too long and the light hasn't got to the base, and the tillering is what we call aerial tilled, and the mower comes off and takes all of that, and all that's left is this green patch around the outside where the light has been able to penetrate along the side and daughter tillers, and it's completely opened up. So the answer is pretty simple, really, about how to tell whether your grass has recovered. And it's when this remnant leaf begins to die or has died. That is a telltale sign that this plant has recovered. Now, why do we want to know that that's recovered, and why is this the easiest way to tell? Is because different grass plants have different amount of live leaves. So some plants, a la ryegrass plant, has 3 live leaves at any particular time. But other grass plants have more live leaves. So by counting the amount of live leaves doesn't necessarily mean that plant has recovered. So you want to have a look at this remnant leaf and when it is starting to die off. Now, there is some conjecture about how long, whether this is starting to die off. You'll see that it starts to not have chlorophyll in it. The green part of the grass plant will start to draw out of that remnant grass. So that's why it starts to go that brown color. There is some conjecture on whether we have to wait for it to completely die or partially die. That's for some people, that's what they will say, it needs to completely die. Others will say once it's starting to die, I want to take off that grass. I've recharged the bacteria, I've recharged the root system. That's a good enough time to go. So that, again, there's just a little bit, but this is what I would say is the most important thing to do, is to walk around your pastures and have a look for this blunt leaf and find it where it was eaten off last time. If you can't find that blunt leaf, maybe, just maybe, you've found a plant that wasn't grazed at all last time the plants were in there. Because we do not graze, animals will not graze 100% of grasses 100% of the time. So you want to actually find some of the blunt leaves to give you an idea. And if you can't find any, well, then you've got plenty long enough recovery time. But that's where, having a paddock book, understanding, by walking around and looking at different times that plants have been grazed will tell you a lot about what the recovery time is for different plants. The other thing to understand with grazing our plants is that sometimes they go into a dormant phase. So, for example, what I talked about before, our C4 or summer active grasses are currently gone dormant. Just like our fruit trees have been dormant over the winter time. They go to sleep. And so they're not actively growing. They might be growing a little bit, but for all intents and purposes, they've gone dormant. And when it gets, and then of course our temperate grasses will quite often go dormant through the summertime because it just gets too hot for them. Although lots of our temperate grasses kept growing this summertime because, it didn't get particularly hot and moisture was still okay for them to continue to grow. They won't go completely dormant, but they will go dormant. And if things go, so frost, for example, is it sends those warm season grasses to sleep. They'll sort of suck back in all the chlorophyll. They'll look after their root battery, the energy reserves, and they'll sit there and wait for things to turn for them. And quite often they're unpalatable at that stage for a lot of our stock. So our stock won't necessarily eat them a lot at that stage. But once the temperatures turn good for that particular plant, up they'll grow and they'll start growing again. So just to highlight that different grasses have different amount of leaves. Broom or prairie grass has 5 leaves. Coxwood has 6 to 7 leaves. Kikuyu, 5 leaves. So they all have a different number of leaves, but how do I tell? Again, I don't need to know these things. I just go and look at that remnant leaf and when it was grazed last time and say, has that plant fully recovered? And what happens if we graze consistently too quickly? We come back too quickly. So an example of that is we're either set stock, so the animals never go off the place, or we come back. We've got 4 paddocks and we move them every week. And so they're back in here 4 weeks after they last left at this time of year. And what happens is our grass plant, this perfectly good, beautiful grass plant, gets grazed. This tries to grow, so it grows its solar panel from this energy reserves. It also, has got rid of some roots in that period to say that to the soil, bring me some nutrients. And then we graze it again. So what it does again is it sheds some roots. It uses this energy reserves from that 4 to 5 centimeters where it stores it, and in an attempt to get that solar panel out so that it can make its own energy. And if we graze it again, and eventually those palatable plants, the plants that the animals like, are grazed out of the system and we leave bare earth. And that's what happens when our recovery is too short or we have set stocked. Now, can this plant handle a quick, every now and again, a grazing that's too quick? Absolutely. Just like our battery, our solar batteries can handle it, taken down quickly again, but it needs to recover. Okay. So yes, it can handle that, but it needs to recover. And so what our grazed animals will tend to do is they'll come and eat the plant that they liked. They liked it last time, they like it again. So and the plants that they don't like, they'll leave. Just like my kids, if they don't want to eat the Brussels sprouts, they will not eat the Brussels sprouts. So they leave it behind. And what happens is that those plants, a la bent grass, sweet vernal, in our grazing systems, they start to take over because they're unpalatable and they're able to finish their life cycle, get fully recovered, set seed, spread by their rhizomes and stolons, and do all of those type of things. And that grass that you want to be growing there has been grazed and taken out. So what if our grazing recovery is too long? We leave it for too long. Say we leave it for 2 or 3 years and we haven't grazed it. What happens then is that we start to see that that environment underneath that dead leaf material of grass plants is a perfect environment for woody plants to grow. So what do I mean by woody plants? That could be blackberries, briar rose, gorse, or it could be a wattle tree or a gum tree. So if our recovery period is too long, we'll often see those plants starting to reappear in that landscape because we've created a perfect environment where it's protected, it's able to grow up to being, 15, 20 centimeters tall in underneath that protection of those grasses and all that dead material, and then up and away it goes. And you don't see that where we have a well-managed grazing system or the mower. If our grazing height is too low, we take off that energy in that battery of those tufted varieties of grasses. And therefore, our productivity suffers because we don't have that energy to push out that first leaf to start that photosynthesis. So if our grazing height is consistently too low, we take out those tufted varieties. So where do we see that happening? Again, we see it with set stock where they're constantly grazing. We'll often see more stoloniferous plants. We'll see clovers, and we see a lot of our tap-rooted plants. So we'll see plantains and chicories, but a lot of the time where it's set stocked and overgrazed is that we'll see capeweed this time of year. Because of that, it's got that tap root that it's able, and it's got bare earth that it's able to take up control over that area. If our grazing height is too high, so using that example of Phalaris, it'll start to, the growing point will start to grow and elongate and start searching for light. And that's where we won't get those daughter tillers that maintain those tufted varieties. So my bias about these type of things is I'm not worried necessarily about seed, grass setting seed. I'm more worried about I've got a perfectly good plant, let it recover, graze or manage it so that it tillers and continues to tiller, either with that rhizome or stolon, or with that tufted variety. So not waiting for that bare earth, for that seed to hit. We just want to keep spreading our plants by that method. And they'll seed naturally enough anyway. If you can ever find a way of stopping our grass plants seeding, perennial plants, there'll be a lot of graziers that would like that, because we know that the quality of our feed drops away when it goes to that reproductive stage. I just want to show this slide to show what different amounts of cover means. So I think this was from Evergray's program again. You know, that what are we trying to achieve? So we're trying to achieve with our grazing management and management of grasslands is we want 90% cover. We want to be able to stand above a grazed area and not see very little bare earth. So that's what we're trying to achieve, is, you know, greater than 70% to 90% cover. And what that means, if we've got all of these perennial plants, it doesn't give an opportunity for an annual plant to set seed and grow. So perennial plants have got the advantage, they tough it out during the hard times, but they have, once it rains, they are able to grow quickly and shade out competition. Whereas that annual plant likes that bare earth. It has to, when the conditions are good, it's got to germinate from seed, come from that seed and start to grow. Whereas a perennial plant is up and away and that first good rain or warmth. Just quickly, I know I'm quickly running out of time, but I've just got to it. The other part of managing our grazing is all about consistency of diet. So what we want our animals to eat is a consistent diet. So I often use the analogy is that I like eating a curry, and if and I make curries at home, beautiful, fantastic. But if I went over to India and ate a street curry in India, it's the same curry, surely, but something different happens to my guts, and it's not pretty. Yet what we do with our animals is that we'll take them from one diet to another diet and expect them to be productive and healthy. So they've got all of these different bacteria and protozoa and fungi in 1 milliliter, 1 mil of rumen fluid, all of these guys. And they need to be fed, and they break down that grass. And so if I have got 100 billion bacteria that are dedicated to a particular grass, a monoculture of ryegrass, and then I go and put them on these animals, I start feeding them, because I've run out of grass, I now start to feed them hay. These bacteria are not programmed to eat hay. And so we see our productivity drop in our animals. So what we want to be doing with our animals and grazing them is giving them a consistent diet, that they've got access to a diversity of foods to eat, so that they've got all of these bugs, for want of a better name, all got something to eat. And if we introduce anything slightly different into their diet, we do it slowly so that the bugs are able to change. So that one bug that's left there to eat millet crop can still breed up and eat a millet crop when it needs to. But that takes several weeks for that gut flora to change over. And it's no different to us. If we haven't eaten a certain food, So Christmas time, all of us get a crook gut because we're eating food that we don't eat any other time of the year, you know. So it's the same for these guys. The other thing to remember is that spring changes everything with our grasses, particularly those that we're managing in a grazing situation, and plants go from vegetative to reproductive. So it's all a bit different. So be mindful of that. So just quickly, what should we aim for? With a grazing regime, we should aim for a diverse grassland with multiple bunches of species of butched or tufted, stoloniferous and taprooted grass plants, a mixture of grasses and forbs, a variety of perennial C3s and C4 grasses, and a density with greater than 90% ground cover. That's all about capturing the sunlight and capturing the rainfall when it happens. So to have green leaves converting solar energy as much of the year as possible. That's what we're trying to do that's what we're trying to do in a grazing situation, is we're trying to convert solar energy into our animals. The most important thing is that grazing is not a recipe. It is complex and it requires thought, knowledge, and observation. So if you started grazing 6 or 7 years ago in this environment and you thought, oh, beautiful, and I've spoken to a few people, they say, oh, I needed recovery periods of such and such. Well, we've had rain the last couple of years. That mechanism doesn't work. That recipe doesn't work. So you need to be changing and watching what you're doing. Your animals' demands change because the environment is changing. Many outcomes are possible. And we should be aiming to graze our plants when most species are close to vegetative leaf maturity, so that remnant leaf is dying off. And the one thing I didn't talk about is that grazing any area should not exceed 3 days, ideally 24. Why? Is because that plant, once it's grazed, what it wants to do is put up a solar panel. And it pushes out that solar panel really quickly. In the springtime, you'll see that beautiful lime color where the plant animals move out of that area, or you've mowed your lawn. And that can happen within hours, that it pushes that leaf out. We don't want our animals to graze that, because that's going to impact on our productivity and persistence of that plant. So ideally, we don't want to exceed 3 days, because that panel is being pushed out by that energy battery, and we don't want the animals to graze that, because that impacts on our productivity going forward. It's not great for them to eat. It's high in nitrates, high in potassium, and it doesn't help their productivity either. But if you are grazing, one paddock for a month and you bring it back to a week, good on you. That's better than a month. So we just want you to change the ways just ever so slightly and get better at that grazing area. Grazing should attempt to leave 4 to 5 centimeters of our desirable plants so that they've got a good way of growing back. It's really difficult to do that because the grazing animal will graze the plant to where it wants to graze it. A pasture of diverse species of plants is really important. Grazing is about feeding the soil as well. So focus on looking after the desirable perennial species. And a grazing animal's well-being and health is supported by a diet that is diverse and vegetative leaf maturity. So I'll open it up to questions. I've gone a little bit over time than I hoped, but we'll open up to questions. You can put up your hand in the feature in the Zoom or type in a question. We'll do a couple of minutes of that, and then I'll stop the recording, and then we'll have some more questions. And as people want to start typing or putting their hand up, there is more information sheets on what I've talked about this evening, primarily on the Macedon Ranges Healthy Landscapes website, but you can get that from your local website if you're in the other shires as well. So thank you. And well, if there are any questions. No worries, Jade. I'll put the this, if I can copy it off that. I'll be able to do that. I'll send it to you, Jade. Jade's sent me a question about what the fact sheet links, so I'll send them to you, Jade. Okay, I will stop recording. Since no one's asking, everyone's a bit shy, I'll stop recording now. And thanks for watching this recording.